Welcome back, fellow griever. This is Down the Rabbit Hole, the space where we tell the truth about life after suicide loss, child loss, and the long road of learning how to carry both grief and love at the same time. I'm Melissa, your host, and I'm really glad you're here. Let's begin. Fellow griever, today's episode feels important to me. And that's not to say other episodes aren't important, but for years now, that's almost hard to say, for years now, we've talked about surviving grief, especially in this suicide loss space. We talk about how to survive the first year, how to survive the anniversaries, how to survive the holidays, even how to survive the initial shock. And all of that matters. It matters so much. But what I don't think enough people talk about is what happens in the years after survival. What happens when you've made it through the first several years? You've done therapy, you've read the books, you've probably journaled, you've cried, you've done the work. And yet somehow, deep inside, you still feel profoundly lost. And honestly, that's where I got lost. Not in year one. Year one, even then, made some sort of sense to me, or at least sense to my brain. Year one was survival. Shock, trauma, adrenaline, all the first, the fog, the complete devastation of trying to comprehend something completely incomprehensible. I always say the worst day already happened. Everything after that is just after. And while that may sound dark to some people, grieving mothers understand exactly what I mean. Year one is indeed brutal, but there's also a strange layer of protection for us there. Our nervous system was doing whatever it can to keep us breathing. And then year two comes. And for me, that's when that cloud cover, that protection, started lifting. That's when the rawness really started setting in. Over the years, I've often compared it to pulling a bandage off a wound that looked healed from the outside, only to realize underneath it, nothing had really healed at all. Everything felt exposed, like raw nerve endings touching air for the first time. The world had largely moved forward. Most people had stopped checking in. Support was fading, resources were hard to find, and life kept happening all around me. But inside, everything still hurt. And somewhere in there, usually toward the end of that second year, like me, I have found that most grieving moms start getting tiny little glimmers. Tiny moments where breathing feels slightly easier. Moments where you laugh unexpectedly. Moments where your nervous system unclenches even for just half a second. And that's usually where hope first starts appearing. Not all at once, not beautifully or magically, just little cracks in the darkness. And eventually, if we're lucky enough to find good support, we start leaning into healing. Not healing grief. You know I don't prescribe to that. The distinction between healing and living with something or healing our trauma and grief does matter. And I know I've talked about this a lot in the past, so I won't go into it now. But grief and trauma are definitely not the same thing. Yes, they're often interwoven, but trauma can go into the healing space. We can heal a lot of the things that are caused by the trauma. The nervous system can be healed, and the body has to be supported in this process. But grief becomes something we learn to carry, something we dance with, something we learn to live beside, something we slowly learn to move with instead of constantly fighting against it. And for a while, the healing work feels productive. I know there's probably some of you listening that aren't there yet, and some of you that are nodding your head in understanding. That healing work for a while is necessary, and it's helpful, and it is forward moving. But then what I found out is eventually, many of us mothers hit a wall no one prepared us for. The now what wall. The place where you realize, I've survived somehow. I've done the work. I'm functioning better. And it's still here. The grief is still here. The longing is still here. The ache is still here. And honestly, that realization can feel terrifying, because I think many of us subconsciously believed there would eventually be some final destination to this, some point where this would resolve, some place where we would finally feel like ourselves again. But what I discovered was that grief had changed shape. And eventually it started asking different things of me. Not survival anymore. Rebuilding. And that, my fellow grievers, is a very different kind of work. Because there's something deeper that often starts surfacing after our initial grieving period and trauma resolution. The collapse of self-trust. I don't think we talk about this enough in suicide loss. The way we began questioning every decision we ever made and make as mothers. Rewriting history in our mind, replaying conversations over and over again, wondering what, when, how, why we missed. What did we miss? Convincing ourselves that somehow we failed them. And slowly, without even realizing it, we've totally stopped trusting ourselves. Not just as mothers, but as people. We stopped trusting our instincts, our decisions, our joy, our peace, and even our ability to move forward. Everything starts feeling dangerous. Even happiness can feel dangerous. And I need grieving mothers to hear me when I say this. When I say this in my year 10 of this journey after loss. This does not mean you are broken. What it does mean is trauma rewired you. That's different. And honestly, that's the space where my body finally intervened for me. About 3.5 years after Alex died, I had what doctors call a TIA, a minor stroke. And while thankfully I physically recovered, emotionally, spiritually, even internally, it was a massive, massive wake-up call. Because I realized something very shortly after the event. I could not bootstrap my way through this one. And if any of you have been listening for a while and kind of know how I am, you know that's exactly how I survived most things in my life. I pushed harder, I worked harder, I adapted faster, I figured it out. Many of you are probably that way too. But grief, traumatic child loss grief, doesn't respond to white knuckling forever. Eventually, just like Bessel van der Kolk tells us, the body keeps the score. Eventually, the nervous system says, enough. And for me, that was the beginning of my real big rebuilding work. Not fixing grief or curing it and not moving on. Rebuilding. Rebuilding my identity, my own nervous system safety, self-trust. Rebuilding meaning in my life. And thus rebuilding a life that could still hold grief and love at the same time. And I think that's the space I feel most deeply called to now. Not just helping mothers survive, but helping mothers understand what happens after survival. Because the truth is, many grieving mothers are quietly standing in this exact space right now wondering, why do I still feel so lost? Why do I still feel so disconnected? Why does my life still feel unfamiliar? And why do I feel stuck even after all these years? And griever, the answer is not because you're failing. It's because grief evolves. And eventually, it asks us to evolve too. Not away from our children in any way. Never that. But into a new relationship with ourselves, with our grief, with the meaning in life, and honestly, who we're becoming now. And that's actually the work I spend most of my time doing privately with mothers these days. Not survival. Rebuilding. Helping women reconnect with themselves after trauma shattered everything familiar. Helping them learn how to carry this differently. And if you're listening today and realizing, oh my goodness, this is exactly where I am, please know you're not behind or broken or even doing grief wrong. You may simply be entering the rebuilding years. And honestly, that kind of support can be really hard to find. Most people don't realize that most of the grief resources out there are designed for those survival years, just getting us to a place of standing up. But that's not enough. We have to go farther. And that's why everything I've done up until this space, I've created organically from a need, from what I see grievers and mothers needing. And most recently, I've launched 2 new monthly gatherings specifically for grieving mothers. Free gatherings. One is a softer support space called You Are Not Alone. And the other is called the Bridge Sessions inside the Rebuilding Room, which is specifically designed for mothers navigating this exact now what space after survival. You can find both of these on my website along with my coaching spaces, podcast episodes, and resources for all suicide loss grievers. And whether you join me there or not, I want you to hear this today. The fact that grief still exists does not mean healing has failed. The fact that you still carry this does not mean you're stuck forever. It simply means this is becoming a part of you. And now, slowly, gently, sincerely, you learn how to build a life around the chasm not erase it, not deny it, or not close it, but learn how to live beside it, one step at a time. So, fellow griever, thank you for wandering a little deeper down the rabbit hole with me today. And if this episode resonates with you, I hope you'll share it with another grieving mom who may need these words too. Next week, we're going even deeper into this conversation, into the fear so many grieving mothers quietly carry, the fear of moving forward, the fear of healing, and the complicated truth that sometimes rebuilding our lives can feel terrifying after child loss. Because grief is not just about learning how to survive what happened. Eventually, it becomes about learning how to live with who we are now. And that's where we're headed together this season. Talk soon.